The individual recognized by history as Edward Tudor was born at Hampton Court Palace in London on the 12th of October, 1537. He was baptized by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer in the Palace Chapel on the 15th of October and was simultaneously proclaimed Duke of Cornwall. His father was a figure of immense stature, Henry VIII, who governed England for the greater part of 40 years, commencing with his accession in 1509. He held the position of the second Tudor monarch and was the first to succeed to the throne, as Henry's father, Henry VII, had largely seized the crown from the Yorkist monarchs in 1485, the Tudors being a relatively obscure family of Welsh origin with a rather tenuous claim to the English throne. The precarious foundation of Tudor authority persistently troubled Henry VIII. He felt a compelling need to secure the dynastic line by fathering a legitimate male child. His relentless efforts to achieve this would unleash a torrent of transformative, political, religious, social, and economic upheaval across England. Edward's mother was Jane Seymour. In 1536, at an age of approximately 28, she became Henry's wife. She held the position of his third wife in a sequence of increasingly rapid marriages that characterized the 1530s. However, unlike several of Henry's other wives, Jane was neither executed nor simply cast aside by the king. Instead, she died on the 24th of October, 1537, less than 2 weeks after giving birth to Edward, her first son. The birth itself was arduous, with labor extending over nearly 3 days and nights, and Jane never recovered, succumbing to complications 12 days later. The world into which Edward was born was undergoing monumental changes, and although the infant Edward would have been entirely unaware of the fact, much of that transformation resulted directly from his father's determined pursuit of Edward, a legitimate male heir. Henry had first married in 1509. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, born in Spain, produced only one child during their lengthy marriage, which lasted until 1533, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. Despite Mary's birth, what Henry truly needed was a legitimate male heir born within marriage, a clear successor to the English throne, who could solidify the Tudor dynasty's hold on the country. His intense desire to achieve this partially explains Henry's growing fascination from the mid-1520s onwards with Anne Boleyn, a daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an English diplomat and a Knight of the Garter. Henry's obsession with marrying Anne in the late 1520s and early 1530s led him to seek a divorce from Catherine by attempting to obtain a dispensation from the Pope in Rome, and subsequently, upon failure, to break away from Rome entirely, proclaiming himself supreme head of the Church of England. In doing so, he began to engage with the new Protestant faith that had recently emerged from Germany. However, Henry was not a doctrinal Protestant. He remained a traditional Catholic and pursued the split with Rome, primarily to fulfill his marital aspirations and to acquire the substantial wealth of the Church in England, Wales, and Ireland. Consequently, having successfully separated from the papacy, Henry swiftly divorced Catherine in May 1533 and married Anne Boleyn 5 days later. Anne's period as Queen of England lasted for almost precisely 3 years. Her ultimate offense in the king's eyes mirrored Catherine's. The marriage failed to produce a male heir. When a child arrived in September 1533, it was another girl, Elizabeth. When a son did not follow, Henry had his second marriage annulled on fabricated charges of adultery and other offenses, and Anne was beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536. Yet again, Henry did not delay long in acquiring a new wife. He married Edward's mother, Jane Seymour, 11 days later. Thus, Jane was Henry's third wife in the span of 3 years, and the relentless quest for a legitimate male heir had resulted in England's separation from Rome, as well as the initial tentative steps towards the adoption of Protestantism in England. Edward's early years were spent residing in various royal palaces situated within and around London, such as Hampton Court. His chamberlain was Sir William Sidney, and his steward was Sir John Cornwallis. Sidney's appointed task was, quote, to have the keeping, oversight, care, and cure of His Majesty's and the whole realm's most precious jewel, the Prince's grace, and to foresee all dangers and adversaries of malicious persons and casual harms to Edward. Access to the young Edward was strictly controlled, with no strangers ever permitted to see him. Access was granted based on social status, and no rank below that of a knight was allowed in his presence. Furthermore, visitors were expected to kiss the young boy's hand. As his safety was paramount, to provide additional protection for the young Edward, His servants were forbidden from visiting London, lest they might bring back the plague. Despite these stringent precautions, based on Lady Bryan's correspondence, it appears that Edward was a happy, healthy, and very energetic toddler. New apartments, complete with several distinct chambers and a dedicated kitchen and bathroom, were constructed at Hampton Court Palace specifically for the young Edward. However, in accordance with the customs of the era, Edward resided separately from his father, and visits were regarded as special occasions. The court would relocate among different residences, depending on which was deemed most suitable for the time of year or particular event. Hunsdon in Hertfordshire would have been one such house that would have been familiar to Edward, as he spent considerable time there with Lady Bryan during his upbringing. His education was entrusted to the care of two men, Richard Cox and John Check. Cox served as his senior tutor, holding the position of headmaster at Eton and known as a rigorous instructor who employed stern discipline to educate his students. The more influential of Edward's tutors, however, was Check. Appointed as the inaugural Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge University, Check was the foremost classical scholar of his generation in England and played a significant role in revitalizing interest in academic pursuit of Greek classical authors within Tudor England. Under his guidance, Edward commenced his education in Greek, Latin, grammar, and philosophy. This curriculum aligned with the standard structure of the new Renaissance humanist education, which had been developed in Italy during the 14th and 15th centuries and had spread to Northern Europe in the early 16th century. A portion of this education involved reading works that remain familiar to school children today, such as the fables attributed to the ancient Greek writer Aesop, but also texts by other less widely known classical authors like the Roman poets Dionysius and Cato. Most significantly, Edward would have been introduced to the philosophical and political writings of the two preeminent thinkers of ancient Greece, Plato and Aristotle, as well as mastering the art of rhetoric, a skill all children of royal and noble birth learned through the works of the Roman authors Cicero and Quintilian. This education was designed for a royal prince, specifically intended to prepare him for a long future ruling England. Information regarding Edward's circle of friends during his formative years is also available. His closest companions were Henry and Charles Brandon, the sons of the first Duke of Suffolk. Charles Brandon, in particular, remained Henry VIII's most intimate friend throughout his life. Two other childhood associates of Edward interestingly originated from Ireland. Thomas Butler, who would later become the 10th Earl of Ormond, a significant lord in the southern part of the country, and Barnaby Fitzpatrick, the son of an Irish lord who had recently accepted a title of English lordship from Henry VIII as part of an ongoing effort to anglicize the Irish nobility by encouraging them to adopt English aristocratic titles. Butler and Fitzpatrick were in England to be raised as English gentlemen, with the expectation that they would return to Ireland as adults and promote the Anglicization of their own lordships in the coming years. While Edward was growing up, the world he inhabited continued to be destabilized by his father's actions. Despite possessing many of the qualities associated with a Renaissance prince, Henry VIII was fundamentally a product of the Middle Ages and regarded his most crucial role as being perpetually engaged in conflict with England's traditional adversaries, France and Scotland. After yet another period of conflict with Scotland in the early 1540s, Henry reached an agreement, the Treaty of Greenwich, with England's northern neighbor on the 1st of July, 1543. This treaty aimed to foster a lasting peace between the two countries by arranging a marriage between Edward, the heir presumptive to the English throne, and Mary Stuart, popularly remembered as Mary Queen of Scots, who had become the new Queen of Scotland following the death of her father, James the Maurice, on the 14th of December, 1542. At the time the treaty was signed, however, Mary was less than 1 year old, and the marriage to Edward, who was 5 years her senior, would not be implemented for many years to come. Henry's aspiration was to see Scotland united with England through this union, thereby making Edward the future king of both England and Scotland. However, the Scots, who had agreed to the terms of the Treaty of Greenwich during a period when their military situation was particularly precarious, quickly reneged on the terms of the agreement. As a result, Henry ordered Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, to conduct military operations north into Scotland in 1544, with the objective of compelling the Scots to abide by the terms of the Treaty of Greenwich, including Edward's marriage to Mary. This action initiated a lengthy war with Scotland and their persistent ally, the French, a conflict that continued for many years into Edward's own reign. This conflict, known as the Rough Wooing, not only impacted Edward's future marriage prospects, but would also significantly shape England's foreign policy throughout his reign. Due to his youth at the time of his accession, Edward's reign was dominated by senior political figures who governed in his stead. Between 1547 and 1549, one man above all others served as the young king's most powerful subject. At a meeting of England's most senior political figures and nobles, held in the Tower of London on the 31st of January 1547, just days after the passing of Henry VIII, it was decided that the new king's uncle, Edward Seymour, would be accorded this position of seniority within the government. During his nephew's minority, he was to be appointed as both governor of the king's person and protector of the realm. Seymour was elevated to the title of First Duke of Somerset on the 17th of February 1547 to signify his preeminent position within the realm. The full scope of his authority during the early years of Edward's reign is evident from his extensive list of titles. By the late spring of 1547, Seymour held the titles of Duke of Somerset, Earl of Hertford, Viscount Beauchamp, and Lord Seymour, in addition to being governor of the king, protector of his people, realms and dominions, lieutenant general of his Majesty's lands and sea armies, treasurer and high marshal of England, and a Knight of the Garter. Yet notwithstanding his titles and power, Somerset's authority still originated from the Privy Council, the governing body composed of over a dozen senior ministers whom Henry VIII had designated as the executors of his will. These ministers had granted Somerset his authority in January 1547, and as Seymour would eventually discover, these same men possessed the power to revoke it. England faced a number of significant challenges at the commencement of Edward's reign. Foremost among these was the ongoing war with France and Scotland, which had begun in 1544 with the Rough Wooing. Somerset had personally led the invasion of southern Scotland early in the conflict, and in the summer of 1544, his forces attacked and burned a large part of Edinburgh. However, thereafter, the conflict had settled into a prolonged occupation of certain border regions of Scotland. In France, the English had, in 1544, taken control of the coastal city of Boulogne, adding it to the English possession of Calais. Nevertheless, these English outposts in northern France had been subjected to almost continuous siege by the French in the subsequent years. A phase of renewed military activity commenced in the summer of 1547, shortly after Edward's accession, again under the direction of Somerset, who led an army of nearly 20,000 men northward. A notable victory was achieved over the Scots at the Battle of Pinkie, located 9 kilometers east of Edinburgh, on the 10th of September 1547. Thousands of Scots were killed or captured, in contrast to only a few hundred of Somerset's troops. However, the outcome of the Battle of Pinkie served to encourage the French to commit substantial military assistance directly to Scotland, resulting in continued stalemate in the years that followed. When peace was finally concluded with France in 1550, through the Treaty of Boulogne, and with Scotland in 1551 via the Treaty of Norham, both sides effectively reverted to their pre-war boundaries. The proposed marriage of Edward and Mary Stuart, which had initially triggered the war back in 1544, was abandoned. Even Boulogne, on which enormous sums of money had been expended constructing elaborate fortifications between 1544 and 1550, was handed back to the French. Edward's government also inherited a swiftly evolving situation in the Second Tudor Kingdom across the Irish Sea and Ireland, following years of neglect. Henry VIII had begun to devote considerably more attention to his Irish possession than many of the English kings in the 15th century. However, due to that earlier neglect, the crown's position there remained quite weak, its authority extending little beyond the city of Dublin on the east coast and its immediate environs. Outside this pale or border region, Ireland was largely governed by several dozen independent Irish and Anglo-Irish lords who paid minimal regard to the English crown's authority and frequently conducted raids against English holdings near Dublin. In an attempt to reverse this situation, Henry had proclaimed himself King of Ireland in 1541 and sought to reform the country through a cost-effective policy of voluntary Anglicization. This approach proved ineffective, and by 1546, the administration in Dublin was embarking on a costly policy of localized military conquest in the Irish Midlands, where England was soon establishing its first significant colonies of the early modern period. Somerset's administration was strongly in favor of this strategy. And, mirroring the wars against Scotland and France, he directed significant funds towards the erection of military outposts in Ireland during the late 1540s. However, the outcomes were inconsistent, and the government in Dublin quickly found itself overseeing a number of expensive military engagements that were proving impossible to win against an enemy that employed guerrilla-style tactics. Nevertheless, Edward's reign is noteworthy for witnessing the implementation of increasingly aggressive strategies of conquest and colonization in Ireland, which would ultimately lead to the country being fully brought under English rule over the course of the 16th century. This aggressive foreign policy pursued during Somerset's Protectorate had significant consequences domestically. Henry VIII's wars had ensured that Edward inherited a very difficult financial situation in England and Wales. The expense of maintaining large armies on the Scottish border, and particularly in France, had prompted the regime to begin debasing the English coinage by reducing the purity of silver content in English coins. This practice did not escape notice, either within the country or internationally, and by Edward's reign, it was widely recognized that English coins were no longer worth their stated value. Of more immediate concern was the issue of agricultural reform. The early 16th century had seen the expansion of the enclosure movement, whereby landlords and significant landholders were fencing off the common lands that had been available to peasants and farmers in every village across England and Wales during the late Middle Ages. However, by the 1540s, this process had accelerated to a point where it was generating considerable friction between the landowning class and the common people, while unauthorized enclosures were being created throughout England. Directing his attention to this matter on the 1st of June 1548, Somerset issued a proclamation prohibiting illegal enclosures. However, this measure and efforts to tackle the problem through parliamentary legislation did little to resolve the issue, and unrest concerning agricultural practices continued to escalate. The most striking feature of England's domestic policy during Somerset's time as Lord Protector, however, was unquestionably the religious policy introduced in Edward's name. Henry VIII's pursuit of a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and subsequent marital difficulties in the 1530s had led him into associations with a number of English Protestant theologians during that period. These theologians had capitalized on Henry's desire to break with the papacy to introduce a series of church reforms aligned with the teachings of Martin Luther and other continental reformers. An English translation of the Bible, produced by William Tyndale, became the first Bible printed in English in 1535, removing the necessity of relying on the Latin Bible, a central tenet of European Protestant reformers. In 1533, Thomas Cranmer, a high-ranking church official who had been prominent in establishing the theological and legal basis for Henry's divorce from Catherine, was appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury. As the years progressed, Cranmer, already a reformer, gradually moved further towards a position of evangelical or radical Protestantism. Under Cranmer's leadership of the Church of England and the influence of Henry's chief minister in the 1530s, Thomas Cromwell, liturgical and doctrinal alterations were introduced, such as the 10 Articles of 1536 and the Bishop's Book of 1537, which instituted many changes in how the people of England were to practice their faith in accordance with Protestant concepts. For example, the 10 Articles stipulated that images and iconography could continue to be used in English churches, but the worship of images was now prohibited. It was also declared that the concept of purgatory lacked clear biblical support, and the notion that papal indulgences could liberate individuals from purgatory was dismissed as being doctrinally unsound. Thus, Protestant reforms were being introduced in the 1530s. Yet Henry himself was not a Protestant, and the 1540s had actually seen some reversal of these earlier reforms. The commencement of Edward's reign now presented an opportunity for advanced Protestants, such as Cranmer, to implement a much broader range of religious reforms and fully establish the Protestant Reformation in England. During the late 1540s, under Cranmer's direction and with Somerset's support, English became the official language for religious services in England, Wales, and Ireland. New forms of worship were introduced that brought the church into closer alignment with standard practices in the Reformed churches of Germany, Switzerland, and other regions where Protestantism had taken root. An act of 1549 removed the prohibition on marriage for priests. Most significantly, the manner of worship and the physical appearance of churches throughout England were dramatically altered. In a wave of state-sponsored destruction of religious images, religious figures and depictions were stripped from church walls and altars, and the interior walls of churches were whitewashed to remove the symbols of wealth and extravagance that had come to characterize the mass under the influence of Rome. The attire of priests and ministers was also reformed. Plain clothing, rather than the elaborate robes of the Catholic Church's clergy, was now to be worn by Anglican clergy. Finally, and most importantly, in early 1549, Cranmer oversaw the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer, a compilation of prayer books intended for use in the newly established Anglican Church. This book contained clear instructions on how the Mass was to be conducted and how prayers should be offered throughout Edward's dominions. Further guidance was provided within it for the performance of baptisms, confirmation, and marriage rites. All of the religious ceremonies and directives outlined therein leaned heavily towards evangelical or radical Protestantism, as it was being practiced among the second generation of Protestant reformers in Germany, Switzerland, and the Low Countries by the 1540s. Collectively, all these measures amounted to a complete introduction of the Protestant Reformation throughout Edward's kingdoms between 1547 and 1549. This was unquestionably the most significant development of Edward's entire reign. Cranmer had hailed Edward as a second Josiah and had expressed hope that the new king would see idolatry destroyed and images removed upon his accession in 1547. Such pronouncements raised the question of where Edward's own religious sympathies truly lay. Was the Protestant Reformation that occurred in England in the late 1540s and continued into the 1550s driven entirely by figures like Cranmer and Somerset, or did Edward himself play a role? Surprisingly, evidence suggests that by the age of 11, Edward was exhibiting clear leanings towards radical evangelical Protestantism. His writings from late 1548 demonstrate personal condemnations of the Pope in Rome and belief in tenets such as justification through faith, the Protestant principle that held that individuals would achieve salvation solely through God's grace, and that no actions such as prayer or the purchase of indulgences could be used to attain salvation. In the years that followed, Edward's household also became a frequent gathering place for prominent evangelical Protestant ministers who preached before the young king. Had he survived into adulthood, Edward would unquestionably have been an advanced Protestant monarch. In the summer of 1549, this widespread discontent found tangible expression as rebellions convulsed England. Around the time of his accession, Edward had begun maintaining a chronicle of his life, effectively a diary, yet one that provides considerable insight into how this child perceived the events unfolding around him in a kingdom of which he was sovereign, but over which he did not yet exert his own direct control. This chronicle covers the years from 1547 to 1552 and contains a notable entry concerning the unrest that erupted throughout England in the summer of 1549. The people began to rise in Wiltshire. Then they rose in Sussex, Hampshire, Kent, Gloucestershire, Suffolk, Warwickshire, Essex, Hertfordshire, a piece of Leicestershire, Worcestershire, and Rutlandshire. After that, they rose in Oxfordshire, Devonshire, Norfolk, and Yorkshire. This is how the uprisings registered in the mind of a child king, and it provides a succinct overview of the widespread nature of the unrest. On the ground, the situation was even more chaotic and violent. The two most significant regional revolts were in Norfolk and the English West Country. However, there had been some unrest in Cornwall as early as the spring of 1548, opposing the enclosure movement and the removal of religious images from local churches. This unrest escalated the following summer into a comprehensive rebellion throughout Devon and Cornwall in reaction to the publication of the Book of Common Prayer and the liturgical and doctrinal alterations it contained, compounded by dissatisfaction with the deteriorating economic situation across Edward's kingdoms as inflation soared and the purchasing power of English currency plummeted dramatically. Ultimately, after the rebels captured the town of Exeter, the Prayer Book Rebellion, as the revolt in the West Country became known, was suppressed when Somerset dispatched a large military force to the southwest in July 1549. By the time it was fully quelled in August, over 5,000 rebels had perished. The rebellion in the West Country mirrored others elsewhere in England during the summer of 1549, in that it was a popular uprising fueled by economic concerns and triggered by the new measures to introduce Protestantism across the country. However, this rebellion was surpassed in significance by a revolt in East Anglia, near London, in July 1549. Rebels formed encampments in Norfolk, protesting against landlords who had defied Somerset's directives to limit the spread of enclosures. This insurrection was led by Robert Ket, a tanner from Wymondham, and is consequently known as Ket's Rebellion. It commenced on the 22nd of July when Ket and his followers occupied Norwich, which at the time was England's second largest city. The rebellions added to a growing list of difficulties confronting the Lord Protector. Another complication facing Somerset had been created by a close family member. The Protector's younger brother, Thomas Seymour, had been seeking a more prominent role in the governance of the kingdom since the beginning of his nephew's reign. Somerset had attempted to satisfy his ambitions by granting him offices and appointment to the Privy Council. But Thomas harbored higher aspirations. Astonishingly, his methods included attempting to bribe the impressionable young king to secure his support for Thomas's demands. In the spring of 1547, Seymour then married Henry VIII's widow and Edward's stepmother, Catherine Parr. While this marriage alone would have generated sufficient controversy, the situation escalated further in the summer of 1548 when Catherine, who had become pregnant by that time, discovered Seymour embracing Princess Elizabeth, Edward's half-sister and the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The princess was only 14 years old at the time. Subsequently, when Catherine died in September 1548 due to complications following childbirth, Seymour appears to have developed intentions to then marry the king's half-sister, potentially positioning him to become the consort of a possible future queen. However, before his scheme could fully materialize, Seymour's activities became public knowledge. Outraged, the Privy Council ordered Thomas's arrest in January 1549. He was tried on various charges of misconduct, including manipulating the king, and was ultimately sentenced to death and beheaded on the 20th of March, 1549. Although Somerset had not been involved in his brother's plotting and had attempted to restrain his most reckless behavior, the entire affair further undermined Somerset's authority as the head of the minority government. The cumulative effect of these scandals and widespread unrest diminished support for Somerset, compounded by unfavorable developments in the wars with France and Scotland, as the French initiated renewed attacks on England's outposts in France at Calais and Boulogne in 1549. Furthermore, the nearly continuous conflicts in the north, on the continent, and in Ireland had strained the finances of Edward's government to their limit. Consequently, over the course of 1549, support for Somerset's leadership simply began to dissipate as the country lurched from one crisis to another. This culminated in early October 1549 when the Privy Councillors, many of whom were the executors of Henry VIII's will and the designated guardians of the kingdom during Edward's minority, made it unequivocally clear that Seymour no longer commanded their support. In response, Somerset absconded with the king to Windsor Castle on the 6th of October, clinging to the belief that possessing custody of Edward might allow him to retain his preeminent position within the government. Edward himself documented these events in his chronicle. The council, about 19 of them, were gathered in London, thinking to meet with the Lord Protector and to make him amend some of his disorders. He, fearing his state, caused the secretary Sir William Paget in my name to be sent to the Lords, to know for what cause they gathered their powers together, and if they meant to talk with him, that they should come in peaceable manner. A standoff lasting 5 days ensued, but Somerset had miscalculated. By departing London for Windsor, the Duke had retained physical possession of Edward, but he had effectively ceded control over the army and the Crown Ordnance, housed in the Tower of London, to the Privy Council. Eventually, recognizing that his cause was lost, Somerset surrendered on the 11th of October. Somerset was confined to the Tower in the aftermath of the events of October 1549. He was formally removed from his position as Lord Protector of the realm by an Act of Parliament in January 1550 and stripped of his other offices. However, despite some calls for him to be tried and executed for his actions, he was granted his freedom. Indeed, over the course of 1550 and early 1551, the Duke was partially restored to favor and reinstated in some of his lands and offices, including membership of the Privy Council. Nevertheless, doubts concerning his true intentions were never completely dispelled, and in October 1551 he was arrested on the suspicion of plotting a new rebellion against the council. These subsequent accusations were almost certainly without foundation, but they proved sufficient to permanently eliminate Somerset. In December, he was tried and found guilty of felony, and he was executed on Tower Hill on the 22nd of January 1552. This was the Earl of Warwick, John Dudley, who was both a Privy Councillor and the Lord Great Chamberlain of England. He had risen to become one of the most prominent political figures in England on the strength of his military service as governor of Boulogne in France in the mid-1540s. In February 1550, Dudley's position as Somerset's successor at the head of the government was confirmed when he was granted the title of President of the Privy Council. His preeminent status among the English nobility was subsequently formally recognized on the 11th of October 1451 when he was created the first Duke of Northumberland. Despite his elevation to this office, Northumberland would never command as much authority as Somerset had between 1547 and 1549. This was partly a consequence of the council's reluctance to invest as much trust in a single individual as had been granted to Somerset in 1547. However, it also reflected a change in the king himself. There are indications that by 1551, as Edward entered his teenage years and developed his own awareness and determination to rule, he increasingly began to assert his own influence over the government. Evidence exists, for instance, of his disagreements with members of the Privy Council from this point onwards, and letters in which he forthrightly reprimands senior officials and councillors for their conduct, a demonstration of his growing understanding of his own royal authority. For example, when John Hooper was being confirmed as Bishop of Gloucester in July 1550, Edward personally struck out all references to the saints in the version of the Oath of Supremacy appended to the relevant documentation. As one of the leading historians of Tudor England, Diarmaid MacCulloch, has observed, quote, "This was a Henry VIII in the making." This burgeoning independence was mirrored in the surviving visual representations of Edward from the period. In 1551, he sat for a portrait painted by Guillaume Scrots, which is now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris. In this depiction, Edward's gaze appears more mature than in portraits from the late 1540s. He stands confidently, his hand resting on the pommel of his rapier, his assurance in his monarchical authority beginning to manifest. Northumberland would have found it considerably more challenging simply to act as though he could disregard Edward in the early 1550s, in the way that Somerset had been able to do just a few years earlier. This increasingly personal style of rule was not as eventful as the years of Somerset's Protectorate. With the conclusion of the war with France and Scotland and the establishment of peace under the Treaty of Boulogne in 1550, the conflicts that had persisted almost without interruption throughout the 1540s came to an end. The primary concern in the aftermath was to restore order to the government's finances and to attempt to address the numerous economic and social issues that had triggered the revolts in the summer of 1549. By the time Northumberland assumed control of the government, the crown carried debts amounting to $300,000, an enormous sum for that era. Inflation had risen by approximately 75% since the commencement of Edward's reign, and the exchange rate of sterling had virtually collapsed. To address these challenges, Northumberland, with the backing of Edward, adopted a multifaceted approach. Firstly, the Treaty of Boulogne contained a provision stipulating that in return for relinquishing the town of Boulogne back to the French, Henry II's government in Paris would pay $180,000 to England. This payment made substantial inroads into covering the costs of the wars, which had ended in complete stalemate by 1550, and significantly reduced the national debt. Secondly, efforts were undertaken to reform the coinage and improve the value of the currency. Attempts to alleviate the social tensions that had contributed to the revolts of 1549 met with more limited success. While some efforts were made to reform county administration through measures such as the standardization of the appointments of Lord Lieutenants, it is difficult to gauge the overall effectiveness of these initiatives. It is possible that the most severe phase of unrest had simply exhausted itself in 1549, and that the outbreak of serious epidemics of the sweating sickness across England in 1551 and 1552 simply curtailed the capacity for the kind of social gatherings necessary to generate further regional unrest and rebellions. Closer to home for the king, the outbreak of this sweating sickness, most likely a hantavirus, tragically claimed the lives of two of Edward's closest childhood friends in 1551. Finally, Northumberland's time as head of the government was characterized by a consistent continuation of the Protestant religious settlement that had been established during the years of Somerset's influence. As Edward matured into adolescence, it became increasingly apparent that the radical Protestantism that had marked the early part of his reign was not something that had been imposed upon an easily influenced king by his older advisors. By the early 1550s, it was clear that the young king was a dedicated Protestant, potentially holding Puritan leanings. and that England under his rule would continue on the religious path that Cranmer and his associates had charted in the late 1540s. Northumberland himself was not a radical evangelical Protestant, but he was acutely aware that Edward would reach his majority in October 1555, at which point he would turn 18. If Dudley wished to retain a significant position in the adult king's government, he would need to advance Edward's goals of radical church reform. Accordingly, in an effort to appeal to Edward's religious sensibilities, Northumberland became a patron of evangelical Protestants. Dudley promoted religious radicals such as John Hooper and John Pinnet to the bishoprics of Gloucester and Rochester. In 1552, a new version of the Book of Common Prayer was issued, this one explicitly rejecting the doctrine of transubstantiation, in line with the most current continental Protestant beliefs. Fresh doctrinal articles were published in 1553 which denied the existence of purgatory, aligning with the thinking of Jean Calvin as expressed in his Institutes of the Christian Religion and the writings of other reformers. Perhaps most notably, in the summer of 1553, an offer had been extended to appoint Philip Melanchthon as Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge University. Melanchthon was one of the foremost leaders of the Protestant Reformation in his day and was second only to Martin Luther within the hierarchy of the early German reformers. Ultimately, he never accepted the position at Cambridge, but the fact that his appointment was seriously considered represents a striking indication of the direction of religious policy in England towards advanced evangelical Protestantism during the years of Northumberland's ascendancy. Edward's court was also becoming a center for Renaissance learning during the years of Northumberland's dominance, continuing the tradition established by Edward's father. This tradition would also flourish during the long reign of his sister, Elizabeth. One individual who played a prominent role in this regard was William Thomas, a Welshman who had spent several years in Italy and had returned to England to assume a position as clerk of the Privy Council. During Edward's reign, he introduced secondhand the writings of the Florentine political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli into England, including his infamous work, The Prince. Guillaume Scrot served as the established court painter under Edward, and his portraits of the king and other senior nobles at court exemplify the latest Mannerist style popular among European painters. Perhaps most remarkable was the patronage extended to Robert Recorde, a Welsh mathematician and early scientist who would, some years later, invent the equal sign. His creation of mathematical and navigational instruments made significant contributions to early English colonial ventures by enabling more sophisticated maritime navigation and map-making. Such innovations in instrumentation, map-making, and scientific inquiry were particularly opportune. The final years of Edward's reign saw some of the initial efforts to expand England's overseas activities. While the first colonies established by the Tudors in Ireland were founded under Somerset's administration, more ambitious initiatives were beginning to be conceived and executed. In 1551, 1552, and 1553, with the encouragement of Edward's government, Thomas Windham undertook 3 voyages to Africa, twice to Morocco, and finally to the Gold Coast of Africa, potentially marking the first English voyage ever to the Gulf of Guinea. In 1553, Stephen Burrough also became the first English navigator to reach the White Sea in northern Russia. Burroughs' expedition was supported by a group of London merchants whose objective was to find a northeast passage to China through the Arctic. They would not succeed in this endeavor, but they did establish trade and political ties with the nascent Russian state and founded the Muscovy Company, which would operate until 1917. This company represents a major legacy of the overseas exploration and trade initiatives sponsored by Edward's government in the early 1550s. Back in England, however, Edward was steadily approaching the age of majority. In anticipation of this, one of the singularly most important decisions for the king had been reached in 1551. Following the establishment of peace with France in 1550, negotiations commenced to forge a marriage alliance between the newly at peace nations, specifically for Edward to marry Elizabeth, the 6-year-old daughter of King Henry II of France. In the early summer of 1551, the Bishop of Ely and the Marquis of Northampton were dispatched to France to initiate discussions. The French king was presented with the Order of the Garter, the highest chivalric order bestowed in England, and the terms of a marriage agreement were worked out. A month later, Jacques d'Albon, Marquis de Fronsac, arrived in England where Edward was made a member of the French Order of St. Michael, and the terms of the marriage were finalized. Elizabeth was to bring a dowry of 200,000 crowns, a substantial sum, and the marriage agreement would only be completed when Elizabeth reached 12 years of age. Thus, Edward would not marry until 1557 at the earliest. But in the summer of 1551, it had been agreed that his bride would be the daughter of the French king, potentially mitigating the likelihood of future conflict between England and France. However, Edward was not destined to marry the French king's daughter, nor anyone else for that matter. In 1553, his reign was prematurely cut short in his youth. Historians have only been able to speculate regarding the cause of Edward's illness and eventual death. Some have argued that he contracted tuberculosis in late 1552, and this began to manifest itself the following spring, while others have suggested that he developed a chronic lung infection associated with the flu he contracted in early 1553, and that he was also suffering from septicemia accompanied by kidney failure. Whatever the underlying cause of Edward's illness, he was clearly in a terminal state by May 1553, and rumors to this effect were widespread, not only in England but throughout Europe. The death of the Protestant king was imminent, and the next in line to succeed him was his half-sister Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic. Yet Mary's succession was not guaranteed. Sometime in the early spring of 1553, as his illness took hold, Edward had begun drafting a short document of major significance. This document was entitled My Device for the Succession. In it, Edward outlined his wish that should he die, his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, would be bypassed, and the succession would pass to Frances Grey and her daughters. Frances was the daughter of Charles Brandon, who had been Henry VIII's lifelong friend, and Mary Tudor, the late king's sister and Edward's aunt. Thus, Frances Grey and her daughters possessed a strong claim to the throne. However, considerable political maneuvering was involved in this decision, beyond mere claims of bloodline. Edward's government was clearly attempting to prevent Mary Tudor from ascending to the throne, as her accession would undoubtedly lead to the overturning of the Protestant religious settlement, which had been so hard won during Edward's reign, and the English church being brought back under the control of the papacy in Rome. Consequently, the Grey family was identified as a means of blocking Mary's path to the throne. The situation developed further in the early summer of 1553 as Edward's illness became definitively fatal. On the 21st of May 1553, Frances Grey's eldest daughter, the 12-year-old Jane Grey, married Guilford Dudley, one of Northumberland's sons. Just days later, Edward's device for the succession was amended to specifically recognize Jane as his heir. As a result, the Protestant regime would be secured and presided over by Jane Grey as Queen of England, with Northumberland leading the government. Despite Northumberland's considerable influence over these developments, Edward's own role in formulating this succession plan cannot be overlooked. The device is written and contains corrections in the king's own handwriting, and by 1553, he was a 15-year-old with his own independent thoughts and initiatives, rather than the easily swayed child of the late 1540s. Thus, there is every reason to believe that it was Edward's genuine desire for Jane Grey to succeed him. The device would soon need to be put into effect. In June 1553, the king's health deteriorated rapidly. On the 10th of June 1553, his physicians predicted he had only 3 days to live. He survived for 4 additional weeks, enduring a terrible final illness. During the last 2 weeks of his life, he experienced symptoms such as his hair and nails falling out, and he had difficulty breathing. When he finally died on the 6th of July 1553, it must have brought a measure of relief to the king himself and to those who had witnessed his suffering for weeks. In the aftermath of his death, England was plunged into a succession crisis. Northumberland and his supporters immediately moved to install Jane Grey as queen. On the 9th of July, she was proclaimed as Edward's successor. However, Dudley and his confederates had gravely underestimated Mary Tudor's resolve to claim the throne. Marching southward from Hertfordshire towards London, Mary rallied support for her declared Catholic cause. Her efforts proved successful. On the 19th of July, a faction within the Privy Council in London, led by Henry VIII, the 19th Earl of Arundel, shifted their allegiance from Jane to Mary, basing their decision on the argument that Edward's device had not been fully established in law. Jane was imprisoned, and Northumberland was executed for treason in August. Jane suffered a similar fate the following year, just as Catholicism was being reinstated across England under Mary's rule. Consequently, Mary's succession, which Edward had strenuously sought to prevent, ultimately resulted from Edward's death in 1553. Edward VI lived a short and somewhat sorrowful life. He was the legitimate male heir that his father, Henry VIII, had fundamentally destabilized England in his efforts to produce. He never knew his mother, who died due to complications related to his birth. Subsequently, when his father also passed away in early 1547, Edward became King of England and Ireland at the tender age of just 9. His youth ensured that his brief reign was governed by transitional administrations, led first by his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, until late 1549, and then by the Duke of Northumberland from early 1550 until Edward's premature and agonizing death in the summer of 1553. While his short reign did not permit Edward to rule the Tudor dominions as an adult sovereign, it was nonetheless a highly consequential kingship. During Edward's time on the throne, England fully transitioned from a country that had merely experimented with Protestantism under Henry VIII to a country that definitively embraced radical evangelical Protestantism. The altars of churches throughout England and Wales were dismantled, the walls were stripped bare of decoration, leaving only the underlying stone, and the Mass was celebrated in English, adhering to doctrinal and liturgical practices championed by Luther, Calvin, Melanchthon, and other continental reformers. Peace was also achieved with the French in 1550, and a marriage alliance between England and France had been successfully negotiated. Finally, in Ireland, a program of conquest and colonization had been initiated in the late 1540s, which would eventually result in that country being conquered and fully integrated into the English state by the early 17th century. What is your assessment of Edward VI? Do you view him as merely a figurehead manipulated by individuals like Somerset and Northumberland, who effectively ruled England in his place? Or do you believe he was a strong individual who shaped the profound changes that occurred across the Tudor territories during his brief reign?